Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Naomi Schaefer Riley, a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. Here at AEI, we are concerned with finding solutions to help the most marginalized Americans. And as you know, few fit that bill more than the 500,000 children who spent time in our foster care system last year. In recent years, the news has been filled with stories of thousands of kids all over the country sleeping in hotels, shelters, and even child welfare offices. Despite the fact that the overall population of kids in foster care has gone down, the number of children without placements, as they're called, seems to be skyrocketing. And despite outrage from the media, the public, and even the judiciary, few states have made much progress on fixing this problem. Just to give one brief example recently from the news, in the past 5 years, the city of Philadelphia has actually cut in half the rate of children going into foster homes and other placements. But according to the Philadelphia Inquirer, in the fiscal year ending June 30th, more than 300 children spent at least one night in Philadelphia's child welfare office. That number roughly tripled over previous years. It actually gets worse. As the paper details, calls to police from that building, that child welfare office, reached a 5-year high in June when more than 80 calls were made for reasons including disorderly conduct, person with a weapon, missing persons, assaults, and break-ins. A list of AWOL youth that circulated in June, obtained by the Inquirer, shows that a supervisor ordered security to bar those children from entering the building unless a child care worker gave authorization to admit them. This is a problem that is affecting blue states and red states. Just last week, U.S. District Judge Janice Graham-Jack again threatened to hold Texas's Child Welfare Agency in contempt of court for failing to find appropriate placements for kids. From Kansas to California to Georgia to Illinois, few states have escaped this problem, and no amount of outrage or legal threats seems to be fixing it. So how did we get here? What policies have led us to this point? How have our incentives so poorly aligned with our actual goals, and what can we do to dig ourselves out? I'm excited to be joined today by a talented panel of experts. Tom Rawlings is the former director of Georgia's Division of Family and Children's Services. He was previously the director of the Office of the Child Advocate. Sean Hughes is a managing partner for government relations at Social Change Partners. Janet Kelly is a senior advisor to Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin and the founder of Virginia Kids Belong. And Greg McKay is the former director of Arizona's Department of Child Safety. So we're going to hear today from each of these panelists, and then I'm going to moderate a conversation among them. During the last 15 minutes, we are going to take questions from the audience too. So I want to begin by asking each of you to describe what you think are the top 2 most important factors that have brought us to this crisis. We are going to get obviously into the solutions later in this panel, but let's start with your diagnosis. So Tom, take it away.
So in Georgia, we did a study of this population, and I can tell you that on any given night, we have about 60 kids in a hotel or something like that. Almost all of those children have a combination of some autism features on the autism spectrum, as well as untreated mental health issues. Another large chunk of those young people have been either abandoned when they came out of juvenile detention, parents refused to pick them up, or sometimes simply abandoned at a mental health facility or crisis. So what we've got is a failure of other systems to address the needs of these children, and so that the foster care system becomes sort of a safety net for all of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sean?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons, so good thing we have a big panel. I would say there are 2 overriding in my mind. One is that, and Tom touched on this a little, the rising acuity of children and youth in foster care. That's from, I think, 2 sources. One is, Naomi talked about, we've narrowed the front door over the last 25 years, 30 to 40% reductions in the number of kids coming into the system. So the kids who do come through that front door are presenting with a higher level of challenge. I'm a consultant, so I work with public agencies, direct service providers, and they all say kids nowadays are presenting with things that we have never seen before. Secondly, we have a youth mental health crisis going on in this country, more broadly. If you look at the Surgeon General's report from last year and lots of other documented data on this, rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, ER visits are all skyrocketing among young people. and foster youth are not immune to that. So I think the population of foster youth have a level of acuity that we haven't seen before. And secondly, I would say federal policy decisions. We had a law that passed here 5 years ago called the Family First Prevention Services Act that compressed the back end of the system that often serves some of these kids who are in offices now, older youth with behavioral issues, in a couple different ways. Family First restricted 4E funds for non-therapeutic group homes with a couple exceptions. So programs that don't have an intensive mental health component have shut down across the country, reducing capacity to serve older youth. And then secondly, for programs that do have an intensive mental health component and have gone through this process to become QRTPs under the law and maintain 4E eligibility, we've triggered an issue now with Medicaid, where Medicaid says those programs are institutes for mental disease, IMDs, and under Medicaid law, if there's more than 16 beds, Medicaid can't pay for services for young people there. And so even in the therapeutic rule that Family First decided was an important part of the continuum, programs are having to shrink capacity, and that's having downstream effects as well.
Okay, I think Greg was going to go next.
Sure.
Okay.
So I'm going to hit on something each of you said that was really important, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about just operational capacity constraints and just demand that routinely outweighs a child welfare's organization's ability to manage that influx of demand. So just to give you an example, when I took over the state of Arizona in 2015, we had about 150,000 calls a year, and we had about 17,000 backlogged investigations. That meant nobody had gone out yet and found those children and investigated. On top of that, there was another 5,000 incoming every month, which led to a caseload for the average investigator or case manager to be over 200. So when you have that kind of demand, you have, unfortunately, sadly, people that aren't problem solving in the ways that they could or should, and they could be removing the wrong children in the system, which is tragic for children, tragic for families, and crushing to the system. So we had 19,000 children in foster care in Arizona when I began. We removed 1,100 children per month. On the other side of that demand is supply side. There was not enough licensed foster homes or group homes or shelters to take in all of these kids. So they were in offices, they were in motels, they were sleeping in cots next to people's cubicles. So what we concentrated on was, fixing the operational and the process and the capacity issues within the organization and shrinking the system. Eventually where we ended up was 600 children removed per month, 13,000 kids in Arizona foster care, but most importantly, we didn't see any rise in recurrent child maltreatment or returns to foster care from that. So we didn't know that we were not underreacting and causing kids to get re-injured. So that's one. These systems have to be capable of managing such heavy demand, and they're just not. And the other thing is more of a kind of a perfect storm from the policy side. So you have fiscal, policies where the federal government was not going to subsidize states if they were going to use group care. And my immediate cost impact of that for the first year was $50 million. So it started reducing the behavior of organizations using group care when you still need group care. And when you need group care, it's because a licensed family foster home cannot handle the behaviors, potentially behavioral health behaviors or juvenile delinquency behaviors of these kids. So they need a place to go. And at the same time they did that, Tom just talked about kids coming out of juvenile justice and not having anywhere to go, being abandoned. Well, I'll put something on top of that. In our state, in Arizona, they came upon a process by which there might have been a family for a kid to go to, but if they came into the system committing a crime as a juvenile, they fast-tracked them to the foster care system and not the juvenile delinquency system, which caused a whole nother problem whereby foster homes became dangerous, foster children became victims, Kids with delinquency issues did not get rehabilitation. And now in many of these centers across the country, you have police and security guards and workers one-to-one trying to watch a 16 or 17-year-old armed robbery suspect who's in the same area with a bunch of 3 and 5 and 7-year-olds that maybe were removed from a very dangerous home. So it's like the convergence of a lot of really dangerous policies without the work being done in advance to make sure that the communities have the wherewithal to handle these pushes to community interventions. And we're seeing that across mental health deinstitutionalization, juvenile justice deinstitutionalization, adult crime deinstitutionalization. And you know, if we're going to put people in the community, we got to have the capacity to deal with them effectively, and we just don't.
Yeah. Oh, this is my realization recently that the whole desire to improve this system, it's like if I said, I want to build a new house for myself and I wanted to have a great kitchen and all these exciting new features, and the first step I took was burning down the house that I live in right now. And I think that's, you know, a lot of what we're seeing. But Janet, go ahead. Tell us what you think are the top 1 or 2 factors that are contributing to this crisis.
Sure. So in addition to what everyone else has said, I would add that child welfare by nature has to be confidential. You can't be out there talking about individual kids and their stories, and those are not our stories to tell. And yet what happens because of that privacy, which is a very real value and should be a value, is that it creates a lack of awareness in the larger community as to what's really going on behind the scenes. And so we talked over lunch about how we got into this space, and a common theme among most of us was that we had no idea kind of how bad the problem was. When we learned about it, we did something about it, but none of us, and certainly the general public, does not really understand and therefore doesn't have the commitment to use their time, talents, and treasure, their advocacy with legislators and decision makers to really make a difference. And after being in this space now for 11 years, the thing that I am most compelled by is that this is a problem that is too big for government to solve, that we need community partners, faith communities, businesses, and the like to form those public-private partnerships. And so there are not enough of those, would be one. And then the second thing that I've seen is we do have very well-intentioned laws that are implemented poorly, and that creates this just really practical inability to align our values with what's going on the ground and with our practice in child welfare. And so, you know, they're always competing values of, yes, we value family, whether that's a bio family that's really trying hard to get healthy, or a kinship family who wishes they could take on the additional care of a family member, but our system is not really equipped to support them the way that they need. And I'm speaking as a kinship mom there, or an adoptive family who steps up and says, sure, I'll take one of these kids out of foster care, even a high acuity kid. It's just created this very aspirational and, again, well-intended legislation that on the ground is not being implemented, I think, the way even the proponents of the legislation would like. And that's also created, this is a 2B, Naomi, a lack of specialized care. So I know in Virginia, we just were seeing, I hated to even call them high acuity kids. What I want to call them is, these are children with very real behavioral and mental health needs who happen to be in foster care, and our system just has not caught up with their needs yet. Whether that's because the incentives aren't there, whether that's because the advocacy from the community isn't there, it's really not the kids' fault that they're in the situation. And assuming that the adults and the decision makers can better align those values with the practicality on the ground, I think that that's when we're going to start to see some hope.
So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into where Tom started, which is what kinds of needs these kids are presenting with. You mentioned kids who are on the autism spectrum. We talked about kids who have, like, you know, engaged in violent crimes. I mean, I think we need to sort of dig in and ask, you know, why is it that a typical foster family, you know, if we did a better, let's say we do a better job recruiting foster families, which a lot of states certainly could use improvement in. But why is it that a typical foster family, or even a foster family who is, you know, better trained, why is it that they are not equipped to take care of the kids we're talking about? What are the specific behaviors, the specific diagnoses that we're seeing? And when we talk about what kinds of needs they have, are we saying like these kids need to be in a, in a congregate care institutional facility for a long period of time, for a short period of time? I just want to, dig a little more into the diagnoses that you're seeing, I guess. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Sure, let me just give you a good example, a case from down in my area of central rural Georgia, where there isn't much in terms of mental health care. We had a child who had actually been adopted out of foster care. As we were saying at lunch, a lot of times when these children hit puberty, especially, a lot of the symptoms come out. So if the child especially has some autism features, puberty and probably the trauma they've experienced really exacerbates their behaviors. So this child, for example, was regularly stabbing his adoptive mother with a pencil. They had tried to get him care. There was simply no real good providers out there. They finally, they would get the sheriff to come and take the child to the hospital where he would sit for 4 hours and then go back home sometimes. They finally got the child at one point into a crisis stabilization unit in Atlanta, which is about 3 hours away. But those crisis stabilization units can't really treat these children. They can manage them for about 3 days and then release them. And so what you see, the children who are being hotelled are often children who have had multiple placements, oftentimes adopted and then surrendered back to the system. They are, we had a hearing last week in the legislature in which the Ms. Brannon, who's in charge of this population, described numerous situations where children were spreading their own, feces on the walls of the foster home, et cetera. And so these are children that really need intensive professional mental health and behavioral health care, or behavioral control in some situations. And when we think about foster care, we think about little babies and sweet little kids, and that's why a lot of foster parents get into the work. And they are volunteers, basically. But they are not, the system is simply not equipped, and they are not equipped to address this very severe behaviors and behavioral health issues of these children that I believe the mental health system especially has completely abandoned.
You want to add anything to?
Sure. We case studied and served over 100 kids this spring in a task force in Virginia called Safe and Sound, which we'll talk about a little later when we get to solutions. And many of them were kids with eating disorders, kids with sexualized behaviors, violence, justice-involved, DJJ-involved kids, juvenile justice-involved children. And again, they were kids that the system not only was not equipped to serve today, but has not been equipped to serve when they were 3 and 4. I don't believe that children are born monsters. I don't believe that they are born this way. I believe that if we had intervened earlier, in many of these cases, these kids would not have the stories that they had. They're acting entirely consistently with the trauma that they've experienced, the story that they've told themselves about it, and combined with the healing that they have been able to receive and whether that was available.
So I want to talk about kind of one of the reasons we got here. Sean mentioned Family First. I mean, there was a lot of testimony before Family First was passed about the abuses that existed in congregate care facilities and institutions. I mean, certainly one of the reasons we're having this IMD question now is, I think the narrative out there is that these kind of institutions, are prone to abuse. And that it is not safe or it is not healthy for children to be in them. So, what are your thoughts on these? I mean, all of you have had some kind of contact with some of these, and we should talk about it. I mean, there's obviously a huge spectrum of what a group home, what congregate care looks like. But can you talk about this this claim that they are, that they are prone to abuse, or that they're fundamentally abusive by nature, and that kids just don't belong in these kinds of places? How would you respond to that question?
You take it?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's painting that entire support industry with a broad brush doesn't work. It just doesn't work with anybody. It's a matter of departments have to have, good licensing and good assessments and good regulatory and good oversight on these group home and group care facilities so that they make sure that they're compliant with policies. There's always going to be opportunities for someone that is just exploiting a good business model because of foster care crisis and opens up group homes and tries to make a lot of money. But generally, these are people trying to do a good job for a group of citizens that need a lot of help. But the challenge comes when you have a group home, and say it's a 10-person group home, it's a license for 10, and they have 4 delinquencies that came right from court to the foster home instead of to detention. And they might have committed a sexual assault, an armed robbery, an aggravated assault, terrible violent crimes. And they're being just fast-tracked into the foster care system for 2 reasons. And one is because no federal dollars support juvenile delinquency and rehabilitation and housing of delinquents. But federal dollars do support that being done in foster care, so they think in a fiscal equation that makes sense, plus these kids might get better rehabilitation and care and treatment in foster care than they would get into juvenile detention. But the fact of the matter is this: child welfare agencies don't rehabilitate children. They rehabilitate families, parents and families, so that they can ameliorate the issues that brought children into government temporary care. It's not made to rehabilitate children, sadly, and that's what we're hearing a lot with the mental health crisis and the needs not being met. So when you take a group home and you turn it from what was a foster home for group care, whereby a licensed family foster home could not take those children for whatever reason that may be, and now you infuse delinquency in there, there's going to be more potential for violence, more potential for confrontation. And you top that all off with the care industry out there that is doing these jobs. I mean, it's not paying that much money for somebody to be a group home care provider. And anybody in this room who's had experience with either children in foster care or even an aging adult relative that needs to be in a group care setting for their needs, it's sadly oftentimes the level of care we want and they deserve just doesn't happen because the business proposition just doesn't make it really happen. So I think group care really does require extra layers of oversight. They are paid more money for their compensation for caring for kids, but at the same time, you set them up for failure by putting kids in there that are going to just majorly disrupt that place. You're just going to have all kinds of opportunities for badness to occur. So,
yeah, I think what we're getting at is quality, and I do think Family First started that conversation. It requires the QRTPs to go through accreditation. I wish we had had more of a conversation around what does a quality program look like, then we'll pay for this type of program, but not that type of program. I think one of the things that plagues this conversation too is that congregate care is a really broad term that encompasses a lot of different programs. You have the wilderness camps that are in a few states where parents send teens that they can't control, and there's been, I think, a lot of well-publicized abuse in some of those programs. Then you have the community group home, child welfare programs that are more lower level, that are more of a placement arrangement for hard-to-place children. And then you have the more intensive mental health residential treatment programs. And I think the conversation kind of lumps them all together, and that does a disservice to understanding how do we get to quality across all of, because I think there is a place, I don't know about the wilderness camps, but there's a place for different types of programs, congregate care programs within child welfare. But as long as we have the same conversation about them all and we're not differentiating the different type of children they're serving, it's really hard to get to that conversation about quality.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were probably surprised to find that, Paris Hilton was sharing her personal experience when we're having a discussion about, foster care group homes. And, I have no doubt she was, experienced, terrible time at the place where she was sent, but that doesn't look like most of the places that we're talking about. I mean, similarly, I think the New York Times a couple months ago had a story where they sort of showed pictures of all these kids who had experienced, I think, a similar kind of setting. And someone said to me, what was very striking about all those pictures is that all the kids in them were white. Most of them had come from like middle class or privileged backgrounds, and yet somehow the story kind of bled into a story about, foster care and congregate care. And the person I was talking to said, that doesn't look like any of the kids I'm serving. I have no idea, who they're talking about. But that is definitely the danger when we have this kind of whole conversation about these different institutions. Tom and Janet, I was wondering if when you think about kind of, you could think a little bit more about the regulatory, issues that are involved here, but also, what Greg is talking about is, the finances. Obviously, we're seeing, from public funds that finances are getting cut for these organizations, that it's not a business proposition that most people, would take up anymore. And many of these organizations, subsidize their congregate care, using other elements to do that. But their insurance costs have skyrocketed. I mean, the staffing costs with the labor shortage, how do you create, congregate care in this environment that is quality? Is it possible?
Yeah. Let me just briefly on the insurance issue. As a practicing lawyer, I've worked with a lot of these folks, and a lot of the homes can't even get insurance anymore because there's such a danger. But kind of teeing off what Greg said, you've got, since the federal government especially has sort of made congregate care the last resort, then you've got a situation in which the children who are in congregate care now are the highest acuity. They do have the highest needs. Therefore, they're probably going to have the most behaviors. But then you've also got intense regulatory oversight, licensing. And so to give you an example, if you had two teenagers in a group home who did something sexual with each other, not only would the group home get in trouble with the agency, but it would probably also be cited for lack of supervision. So you've got this huge regulatory framework, you've got a very difficult population, and kind of, I don't want to steal Sean's thunder, but when we set up the law to create the Qualified Residential Treatment Program in Georgia, I talked to a number of our group home providers, and I said, "You're all going to do this?" And a lot of them said no, because we can't run a business on less than 16 beds. And if you get more than 16 beds, you're an institution for mental disease, and that's been part of the Medicaid program since its inception in 1967. It was, I guess, coming out of one flew over the cuckoo's nest ideas. But the problem is that these children need intensive behavioral health care, but nobody's going to go into that business if, A, they're going to have the judge in Texas over-regulating them, shutting them down. They're going to have incidents left and right because of the acuity of the children. They can't get Medicaid. They really are being disfavored by the federal government. And they're just regulated to death. It's a free market issue. Nobody wants to go into that business if you can't be successful in it and make it.
I mean, even private philanthropy has gotten out of it. They don't want to be involved with congregate care either.
There was a huge misperception during Family First that these programs profited off of kids. Every program that I work with loses hand over fist, by operating these programs, millions of dollars per year. And so they believe in the mission of the programs, and so they sustain them with private dollars and fundraisers, but they're hard to operate. And then to Tom's point, when you reduce capacity even further of a large campus, it makes it so you can't function as a program. And so it is a free market. They have other options. What we're seeing in California is some of these programs are serving other populations now. So they'll say, well, this country has a problem providing placements for unaccompanied minors. You don't have all the regulatory burdens there. It pays better. We can do that, and we can get out of the child welfare system. Or we can look at children who are on private insurance, and we can be a placement for them temporarily to provide intensive mental health. And so that's getting back to where we started. That's really reducing the capacity within the child welfare system. And that's great that those other populations are being served, but it's really leaving a lack of options for foster youth in the system.
I'd like to comment on that. So that's a perfect example of, so when we had a child come into care, we had to make the best placement we could make possible. And sometimes those placements were into group care for one reason or another. But the issue that the group care providers were always hoping to get from us directors was something called block beds, which meant if they had so many beds and there were so many days in a year, we would consider them blocked and we would pay them regardless if they had foster children in those beds or not. So that was a great business proposition for them. But for me, that de-incentivizes them from helping my children get out of an office or out of a hotel room and into a foster placement. So I refuse to allow block beds to happen because it's good for their business, it's bad for our mission. Well, ultimately, what Sean's just talking about is the influx of unaccompanied minors. Now, the federal government will permit block bed rates for these places, whether there's someone in those beds or not, and they'll pay them 2x or 3x what the state is licensing these beds for. So it's just a simple, hey, I'd rather do business with the federal government and not you, state director, sorry. Well, in the meantime, state foster children don't have a place to live. And this is another big problem that is going along with this kind of perfect storm of why are kids sleeping in offices?
Yeah. Janet?
So, couple thoughts. The consistent theme among every answer is that the supply and demand is off in almost every facet of child welfare. The incentive structures are in the wrong place. That's a financing conversation that probably will take 4 hours and not one. So I will leave that, acknowledge it and leave it. What we are hoping to do in Virginia and your other states, Georgia, Arizona, and California, may have tried this, but for the very first time, we're embarking on a professional foster parent model where one of the parents stays home and the other parent can work, two-parent family, and we would basically, the parent that stays home, it would be their job on top of the monthly stipend that they would get if they were a foster parent. They would do this. It seems to be the only financially feasible thing that I've seen lately that may work, and we're doing a pilot. It seems to have good results in other states, so I'm hoping it will in Virginia. At the end of the day, too, I think the congregate care quality continuum is just like any other continuum in child welfare. You've got some really good foster parents, and then you've got some really bad ones. You've got great social workers, and you've got some bad ones. You've got great congregate care facilities, and you've got some bad ones. They're not immune to that. I've seen some congregate care facilities that do amazing work for kids, and I would just say that they should keep doing that amazing work for kids. I would argue on a short-term basis. Kids need that care. They desperately need that care. Sometimes congregate care is the only thing that is going to get a child stabilized. In my mind, though, and I think all the science and data that I've seen backs this up, kids belong in families. And to the extent that we can get them healthy and stable enough to get back with a family, and that doesn't happen with a 16-year-old kid that the system has failed for 10 years. It happens with a 6-year-old kid that we start intervening early and get those resources and wraparound services in place and those supports in place when they're 6 and exhibiting manageable behaviors, not 16, and just our hands are almost tied. There's this quote that I love, I think it's by Frederick Douglass, that says, "It's easier to build strong kids than repair broken men." And I see that everywhere. And every time I see a kid, a 16-year-old file, and I'm looking through it, I always trace it back to where could this story have changed? And the reality is it could have changed on any day of their lives. On any day of their lives, the right social worker could have shown up, or the right adult could have shown up, the right faith community could have shown up. And I deeply believe that. And if I didn't believe that, I don't know how I could work in this space. That's where I find my hope.
I wanted to ask, one solution that is often offered and one alternative to congregate care is the therapeutic foster home that you're talking about. Paying either, people who have some kind of professional background in nursing or in psychology or something to be able to stay home, to be paid, to be with these kids all the time. So can you, maybe Tom and Greg and Sean too, if you want to chime in about what the research tells us about and what the experiences have been of states that have such a program. Because, I mean, I think, in principle it makes sense, but I think the results have been kind of mixed so far. So, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so I think there's some really good therapeutic care models together facing the challenge is one of them, for example. But I think the part of the issue is there really are a lot of providers out there who say we're a therapeutic foster care provider who don't have that level, okay? For children who have behavioral health, autism issues, I think the therapeutic foster care model can be very good. One of the things that you need to make sure is that your state Medicaid agency actually adds that to the Medicaid plan. That's one of the problems we had in Georgia. Therapeutic foster care is not part of that plan. At the same time, there are limits to what an individual family can do. And if you do have these very extreme behaviors, fire setting, highly sexualized behaviors, then I don't know that even two of the best trained professional foster parents can make that difference. I think that requires, for example, I had my sister recently died, and at one point she had been in the hospital in intensive care. She got her level of treatment there, and then she went to kind of a rehab facility for a little while, and rehabbed there. And the same with therapeutic foster care may be a good step down from a very intense hospitalization or intense program, but it's not the end all be all. It's got to be part of that continuum.
Agree.
I mean, I'm not an administrator, so I haven't tried to build this program, but it seems difficult. California started our reform that has a similar framework to Family First years before Family First, 5 years before it passed. And we still don't have very many therapeutic foster. I think it's hard to recruit. I think there are financing challenges to the model, but we are way behind. And so I think it shows a lot of promise, but I don't think any state has figured out how to operationalize it, how to have that meet the supply-demand question that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, we're starting out with 15 homes. So we're, proof of concept is.
We're not trying to discourage you.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're eyes wide open. It's sort of the worst of all options. It's like, what else can we try in a new way that might work? I think that's the point that we're at.
So one more question before we sort of get into what you think are the solutions. So, I mean, when we have these conversations, and Tom, I think you alluded to this, is only kids with the highest levels of acuity are actually going into these facilities. And then I think, critics of the facilities are often saying, look at the terrible outcomes that kids have in these facilities. But we do have this, self-selecting population, not self-selecting, but we're selecting kids who have already been through 25 foster homes. And I guess the question is maybe like, as a director, how do you, let's say there was availability for congregate care, what is the point at which you say maybe this child could benefit from some kind of intensive rehabilitation, even though that means that there might be like one more foster family who could take this kid in, but we think it's more important to sort of, veer them onto this track of rehabilitation rather than, throwing, another piece of spaghetti at the wall here.
Well, I think Greg hit this point kind of well. You were saying that the child welfare system fixes parents and families. It doesn't necessarily repair the ills of children. Yeah. And so I think what we need to do is look at more of a medical model in determining where the placement should be. Group homes, for example, I've listened to 4 videos this morning of young people who were either in a group home or who had just left a group home. They were receiving long-term support from the group home even after they left. They felt loved there. They felt cared for. So there is a place for that. I think the key to me is you've got to make sure that the capabilities of your facility, just like with a hospital or a nursing home or a outpatient facility or emergency care, is got to be matched to the acuity of the child. And I think what happens all too often is that the agency's determination of the level of acuity needed, or level of care needed, and the facilities capacities for that care often are mismatched. And so, that's always going to be a problem. But that's something that really I think we really need to look at is how do you properly match this child's needs with this facility's capabilities.
Yeah, and I mean, the law requires these systems to habitually keep foster parents in the dark about the mystery of a child that they have under their care. I mean, I shared earlier, my new friend here asked me how I got into this work. And geez, about 20 years ago, I was a detective working crimes against children, and I became a foster parent of a victim of brutal crimes who was 4 years old. And I knew what happened to that child. Now, that was a rare case, and I can tell you almost with 100% certainty, in any other home, that child would have disrupted and would have been moved from place to place to place because the suffering she went through was so much that the people would not have had any idea. So foster families are routinely struggling through the mystery of helping this child, balance, become regulated again. And that moves on through the entire continuum. So when you talk about therapeutic foster home, I agree with Sean. The capacity's just not there. They're just not hanging, off all the trees out there, these wonderful families that can endure the therapeutic models and take in the kids. It all comes back to, we just have too many kids, and too many kids that are really hurt and sick, coming into the communities, in a community that by sheer number aren't ready for it, or preparation aren't ready for it. And then what they do is they close their license. So we used to track data. We had about 4,000 licensed family foster homes and so many group homes for our kids. And we used to track why they let their license go, why they don't renew. And it's almost always, people enter wanting to help in foster care, usually because they're kin or their family and they feel, I have a family obligation to help. Or, they have a certain faith-based calling to want to help in that way. Or we might consider them the woefully misinformed, that enter into this assistance model and then, find out what it's truly like and run for the hills. And we have to get much better about preparing people. I don't know if it's really a policy argument because confidentiality is important and privacy is important, but also you have a human being that's had some serious background that you're now supposed to care for that you get nothing. You're not allowed to have anything from them. So we got to make some changes, I think, there to kind of help with that sustainment and not have kids disrupt out and foster parents go, I don't want a license again.
Could not agree more. There was a study out of Wisconsin, you all may have seen, that 50% of foster parents quit within the first year, 90% quit within 5 years, and often that is due to a lack of social support. And so the one thing that I have seen work through a nonprofit that I helped to found called America's Kids Belong, and I ran the Virginia chapter for years, is the volunteer wraparound support, where people in the community would come around a foster family. Most of these kids were a typical child in foster care, not a high acuity kid. And they would show up with meals, with laundry service, with house cleaning, with decorations for the room, with clothing, with respite care, which is always the number one need, but they were trained and they were background checked. And it is an evidence-based. The high fidelity wraparound, of course, is evidence-based, and that's the only real thing that I have seen move retention numbers, foster parent retention numbers, over my time in care. You may have other ideas, but I'm a big fan of wraparound.
So I want to turn now to kind of the solutions. I mean, we've kind of hinted at a bunch of them now, but I don't know, maybe we'll start with Sean. And, just describe, like, if you could, wave your magic wand, a policy wand, a financial wand, whatever it is, what would you do to, prevent this crisis from continuing?
I think number one, we need to create an exemption from that IMD issue for Medicaid for qualified residential treatment programs. These programs have been recognized under Family First as an essential part of the continuum. They're providing an intensive mental health service within the continuum. There are already exemptions from IMDs in federal law for psychiatric residential treatment facilities, psych wards of hospitals, psych hospitals. We need another exemption specifically for qualified residential treatment programs. So we need advocacy around that, and the federal government needs to do something about it.
And can I just, I'm sorry, Rashawn, I didn't interrupt you. So, I mean, this kind of seems like a no-brainer in a lot of ways. So can you talk about like why that can't happen, why it hasn't happened yet? Because you've been talking about this, for years now, and I hear people on both sides of the aisle say that they think this makes sense. What is preventing Congress from getting this done?
There's no question ideology is a barrier. I think some people just want to see that whole end of the system shut down, whether they provide a mental health service or not. And then I think the IMD issue has been around for a long time, decades, and there's a list of programs that are trying to make their case to be excluded from IMD, and this whole Family First QRTP thing has sort of been swallowed up in that much larger conversation. So I think there's some resistance to just solving it for one group when there's other groups clamoring. But by and large, I think it's an ideological issue. I think there's not the political will to resolve this program. I think many policymakers would say, well, that's great. We shouldn't have more than 16 beds. We don't want an institutional feel. And that makes sense until you start practically running a program. So I would say the IMD thing is the first on the list. I do think we need to go back and look at Family First. So for non-therapeutic, non-QRTP group homes, there are some exemptions that are allowed to continue 4E eligibility for programs that serve youth over age 18 who are doing supervised independent living, for youth who've been sex trafficked or at risk of so. I think we need to add another exemption for the juvenile justice programs, for programs that are serving a role in the continuum as a step down for that, or a diversion from that system from locked detention. I think those programs have been successful, keep many of these kids out of offices, and so I think we should look at providing another exception for those programs under Family First. And then there's this whole issue of therapeutic foster care is a part of the solution, but we need investments in alternatives, and Family First did none of that. It was a budget-neutral law that said, we're not gonna pay for this congregate care stuff, and states, you figure it out. There's been no leadership from the federal level in terms of investing in and providing technical assistance and best practice dissemination to states for how you build alternatives, and how do you finance and structure those. So I would say those would be my recommendations.
Okay. Janet?
Sure. So I was appointed as the lead of a task force in Virginia called Safe and Sound earlier this spring, and I remember when the governor's office said you're going to be running this task force. I was, believed that what everyone told me, which is that it's not going to work. That there is no way that you're going to end the phenomenon of kids sleeping in offices, ERs, and hotels in Virginia, and you're certainly not going to do it by July 1st, which is when I had set the deadline for, naively. And I was completely terrified and intimidated by the job, by the work, and somehow through all of that intimidation found a way forward through a plan that we implemented, made it a governor's priority. We built a multi-agency team of all of the players. Secretary Littell, who's our Secretary of Health, kept reiterating this is not a foster care problem. This is a mental health problem. And we brought in our state Medicaid agency, we brought in our state mental health agency, we brought in our child welfare agency, and we have an Office of Children's Services that funds a lot of our behavioral health for children in Virginia. We met every single day on one kid until we realized we were never going to get through the backlog if we kept on that pace. So I had to call all of their bosses. I had an amazing core team, and I said, I need your folks, your best and brightest. I understand what I'm asking for, but I need them from 8 to noon next week. And we've got to get through this backlog, because if we can get the backlog out, it'll release a pressure valve in the system that will make everything easier. And we can start going upstream to some of those more systemic issues. And I call it Hell Week. They called it Power Week. I think it was a little bit of both. And just powered through our backlog and were able to, through a lot of other things, working with providers to say, how do you get to yes? I understand what this child looks like on paper, but we believe that they're not in this place that they were 6 months ago. They're in a better place. Trust us. And a lot of times they shouldn't have, and they did anyway, and I have to give a lot of credit to those providers. We were able, again, I've simplified the process down to talking points since we're at a panel.
No,
we were,
I mean, I'm just curious, like, you know, Dee, so you're having a conversation with a congregate care provider, and you say, look, I know how this child looks on paper, this is how they actually are, and what? And they found a bed, or
they were able to work with their admission staff to create, I don't know that they didn't create one out of thin air, but they were able to remove excuses. This wouldn't work with our milieu became maybe it could work with our milieu. We just kept asking consistently, how do we get to yes? You need one-on-one help? For the very first time since I've been in child welfare in 11 years, money was not an object. We were able to find the funds to do what we needed to do and work with the providers to do it. And we had several providers that just consistently stepped up. We highlighted those providers to give them attention and credibility.
So where did the money come from?
It was pre-existing revenue streams. We didn't do, none of it was rocket science, and none of it, we did not spend any new money. All of it was existing. And we were able to reduce the number of kids sleeping in an office by 89% in 90 days. Now, our numbers in Virginia were smaller. We only had 324 kids last year who slept in an office, the previous year, 2021. Who slept in an office. So we weren't talking huge numbers. I don't know that other states could take the micro approach with literally going through every single case file like we did. I'm not sure that would work in other states, but it worked in Virginia. One of our highest values, and I really wanna highlight this, is we weren't committed just to getting kids out of an office. We weren't so desperate for a placement that we would put them in the wrong placement. We really tried hard to put them in the best placement. That was actually the hardest part, was finding the best placement for them when they had the files that they had. One other quick thing that I'll just say was a huge lesson learned on this was that asking the agency who was caring for this child all day, every day, some of whom were violent, a lot of the social workers had vicarious trauma that truly did not allow them to see this child objectively. And so we kind of went a level up when we were having the folks describe to the provider, this is who this child actually is. Yes, here's all the bad stuff in your file, in the kid's file, but here's all the good stuff. They shared their potato chips with their social worker at lunch yesterday. We've never seen them do anything kind in the 5 years that we've had this child, and look what happened. Often because the child was getting one-on-one attention from their closest adult relationship, which unfortunately was their social worker. And so as dark and heavy and hard as the work was, I saw so many points of light and so much hope for these kids. And a lot of them, I will say I've followed several of them. It gets worse before it gets better, as is so often the case in child welfare, as you know. But a lot of them are doing, 4 steps forward, 3 steps back instead of 10 steps back.
You also had something where you were getting kids who had been placed out of state back in the state. Can you describe a little bit of that too? Because that is I think part and parcel of this problem. I mean, the kids, that one solution that states arrive upon is, well, if I don't have any place besides an office, I'm gonna ship them to some other state. So what did you find out about that?
It was a function of if you're able to keep, it was this big marble run game. So if you keep getting the child, a child healthy and stable, and you can move them to a lower placement, less restrictive placement, it opens up a bed at the top of that marble run game. And so I don't know that we have been super successful at getting kids back, only because a lot of the children are in highly specialized programs. But we did have some success getting those kids back. Okay, you're finished with this highly sexualized behavior program in Massachusetts. We want you back. It's really not, the kind of generally approved rules of child welfare is, you want the kid as close to the community as possible. And so sending a kid out of state just struck me as not good for kids and definitely not good for taxpayers. We're spending, you all know better than I do, $1,500 a day or more on the kids when they're out of state. And it's switcheroo. It's a Virginia kid's going to Massachusetts, and then one of our facilities is taking a Massachusetts kid, which also struck me as not wise and not good for kids. So,
Greg?
Yeah, so I'm not typically an optimist, but I think you could solve that. I'm glad you guys did solve a lot of that problem, but I do think that's a very solvable problem, that type of backlog, because if we're just focusing on, how do we reduce the number and end kids sleeping in offices and sleeping in cars and motels because there's no placement array left. I have to go back to root cause and running a viable organization that is a viable business. And you really have to shrink the front door of child welfare to recover from this. And like I said earlier, we had 16,000 kids backlog that still needed to get investigated because a report came in that no one went out on. And 1,100 kids, 35 kids a day were removed and brought into care. And so what we ended up doing was instead of having kids go to individual offices, we had 70 offices around the state of Arizona, and there was cots under people's desks at their cubicles. We eventually opened our own welcome center, placement center, which was, kind of a PR political, liability, because we as the state didn't want to become a licensed provider of kids in care. So there was a certain timeline you needed to get them out of your welcome center, but we wanted a place that kids could go where they're upset, there's staff on board, there's a nurse practitioner on board, there's toys, there's places in the area that are age appropriate for the children that are there and much more easily manageable than coming into offices, disparate offices all around the state. So we did that as a Band-Aid measure. And then we went to work on the capacity crisis and the demand. And we eliminated our backlog, 16,000 backlog cases, process improvements, technology improvements, people improvements, tools improvements. Just the mere idea that in Arizona when I began, they did not have any kind of automated safety and risk assessment tool. So can you imagine going out, you have 200 cases open, you come to work, you have 200 other cases that you got to get to, and you go to someone's house and you're trying to do an assessment on 2 or 3 kids without a very formalized process on should you remove, shouldn't you remove, what should I do here? So there was way too much subjectivity in the system, too much duress in the system. So we had too many calls coming into Arizona about abuse and neglect, some of which were wrong, not needed. And we had too many kids being removed into the system because too many open investigations and too many backlogs. So, you got to get down to brass tacks running these systems and reinstall a system of sound business and get it done, because otherwise you're going to have this. And when we talk about these kids in these settings waiting for placement, a lot of these kids aren't needing residential treatment somewhere. A lot of these kids are needing major behavioral health treatment. Some of these kids are juvenile delinquents that should not be there. They should be in detention, 100%. But the large percentage of these kids are just coming in every day by the numbers, and there's no placement array left. And I'll close on this. Organizations need to create a more viable placement array. And when I say that, I mean group homes, foster homes, therapeutic homes, shelters, whatever. That's your placement array. I paid 27 different providers to manage that placement array. And caseworkers picking up a phone and calling and saying, do you have any beds? 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 Guess what that turns into? Just take the kid to the office. We'll figure it out later. Right. Okay? You need a viable process, real-time placement array, so you can say, okay, I have these beds licensed for 4, these licensed for 2, this one therapeutic, this one this, and go. So I really think that reestablishing sound business practice and process is paramount in this, because other than that, from the seat I used to sit in, that was my job. And I'd like to influence policy and figure out how to operationalize policy, sometimes bad policy that we're dealing with. But, sound business and Stop creating policy based on constituency emotions without any way to operationalize it on the ground level. Because all you're going to read is newspaper articles about why this is going so badly, and somewhere along the line you can find some errant policy that wasn't well thought out that had a million unintended consequences tied to it. So that's my solution. One of them.
That's good. How long do you have?
Your magic wand.
So, number one, kind of like Greg, we reduced in the course of 2 years, reduced our foster care numbers from 15 down to 10,000. And part of that was that whenever we needed to remove a child, we would have that case staffed kind of at a regional level. Sometimes I participated in that. We did it in conjunction with the Office of the Children's Ombudsman or the Child Advocate's Office. And to figure out whether or not there was some way to keep that child safe and stable in the home. What we also found during that process is that we could, in fact, keep a lot of children with their families if we had a specialized program for children with severe needs, both either behavioral needs or behavioral health needs or developmental disability autism needs. Right now, of course, I think a lot of us have managed care, and Georgia is like a lot of states in that there's Medicaid managed care for the non-foster population, and then there's a separate Medicaid managed care for the foster population. And if we could simply get some better communication between those different insurers, perhaps we could put services in that would keep the child from coming into care, because if they come in, they're going to probably come in at a higher acuity. Second,
Can I just interrupt, because there's something that you and Greg both said, but I do want to kind of clarify. So, as I said in my introductory remarks, the population in foster care has been going down across the country at the same time as we see more and more of these children without placements. So as much as obviously that is one way to address the overall foster care population, it doesn't seem to be fixing the situation for these high acuity cases or the children without placements generally. So I just want to interrupt there, because I think that's clearly a part of an overall foster care approach. But in terms of the question that we're kind of facing here, we kind of have to figure out why this has paradoxically occurred at the point at which we're saying we've actually reduced the number of kids coming into care.
And like I said, the big point I wanted to make there was simply that if we had more of these services in the community, then we could probably keep some of these kids from coming into care. We did, for the last, 13 years in Georgia, we've had something called the Cold Case Project, which is focused on children who have been stuck in the deepest end of our system for the longest time. And we have actually increased permanency rates for those children dramatically, because we send in a team of outside attorneys and other specialists who sit down with everybody and figure out what we can do to get this child to permanency. That's helped with that population that would otherwise be in a hotel a lot of times. What I really like to see, and I have not seen this anywhere, maybe we can all start this today. A lot of what we said is we don't know much about these children when they come into care. And I don't think social workers are necessarily always very adept at determining what is going on with the child. But there is a great database that everybody should have access to, and that is Medicaid claims. So we could look at the ICD-10 codes, I think they're called, the various medical codes. And if we had some automated system, we use technology to sort of share that information, we could probably see before a child came into care what sort of issues they might have. And for children who were in care, we could perhaps flag things. If, for example, we knew that a foster child had gone to a mental health hospital for a short period of time, then we could begin to flag those cases and do what Janet kind of suggested, which is really provide them with intervention at an earlier point. So I think there is a technological solution to this as well. The final thing I want to say is that the whole confidentiality issue. We have a foster parent bill of rights in Georgia. We were talking at lunch about how Massachusetts just got one. part of that says that the foster parent is supposed to be treated as a valued member of the treatment team. But in reality, because of the bureaucratic, really, I think, probably risk-averse bureaucratic structures we have, then everything is treated as confidential. When in reality, what we should be doing is really sharing with, whether it's foster parents or group home providers or whomever, we should be sharing information about the child's needs, obstacles, strengths, weaknesses up front. And if we could do that, we would end up with a lot fewer situations in which children went to a foster home only to be moved to a different foster home, only to be moved to a different foster home, at which point they start developing attachment issues and they end up in a hospital.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing, Naomi?
Yeah, go ahead.
So one other on a solution side is, again, part of that supply side problem is kids need to exit the system. And when the incoming is outpacing the exiting, then you get the clog up in the line and kids sitting waiting. So another good way to help those exits happen is supporting what's called extended foster care or independent living. So, there's a myth that when a child turns 18 years old, they're handed a hefty bag and said, good luck to you, goodbye. Now, in reality, sometimes that happens because case managers don't really cultivate a relationship beyond 18 because it's one less kid on the caseload. But really what states have is foster care that goes through age 21. And it's similar programming. I mean, and they go in an independent living program where they're provided a stipend, and you can either go to school or you can work, and you still have state-managed foster care in your life. Now, one of the big problems there is that fiscally, the stipend system is not adequate enough to really help these kids launch. So they become used to the group homes. They become used to where they're staying. So they're 18, and they say, you know what, yeah, I'll do the extended foster care, but I don't want to leave my group home. And what that does is it causes a vacancy issue for all these other kids that are waiting to come in. So states should really bolster their independent foster care programs. From the fiscal side, again, a lot of states in the country were paying for that themselves. I, in Arizona, used to fully fund extended foster care when I could have been receiving dollar for dollar match from the federal government if I engaged in a program. So I did that, and it gave us the money to be able to survive the program. And we raised the number from about 800 kids to 2,000. So it's just another way to, launch kids into adulthood with some semblance of employment, a place to live, and some case management so they don't end up homeless or in jail or whatever. And then also freeing up some of that capacity for these kids that are sitting in offices waiting around.
Janet, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have those, we'll start taking those.
So you did what any great child welfare official would do, which is giving kids who aged out more resources and a stipend to have a place to live and prevent them from becoming homeless, addicted, incarcerated, or pregnant. And I think that the aging out phenomenon is on equal footing when it comes to shocking the conscience as kids sleeping in offices. I think there are probably 10 other things in child welfare. Again, we talked about this at lunch too. I call them moral injuries, where the system is so bogged down and so dysfunctional and so broken, despite all the wonderful people who work in that broken system, that we've just come to accept that kids aging out of foster care at 18, or if they're lucky, 21, if their state has that extended foster care system, is seen as a good thing or a normal, typical thing. I refuse to believe that that is the case. I would love for the people in this room to come up with a plan to completely eliminate the aging out phenomenon. I am an optimist. I do believe it can happen. I think kids languishing in congregate care is probably another one of those conscience shocks. Kids not getting the help that they need when they're 6 instead of 16 is another. My conscience is pathologically shocked by the child welfare system, unfortunately, and we need more people. So thank you, those of you who came today to learn more and hopefully engage more.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we have a microphone, so if you want to raise your hand if you have questions, we'll take them. Go ahead.
Nice job, panel. Very nice job. I learned a lot. Greg, you used the term constituency emotions drive decisions. Can you play that out for us?
Yeah, sure. So an upset member of the public or members of the public have a situation unfold that they're upset by, and they contact their local legislator in the state, and then they go to kind of investigating the wrongness of what occurred. And based on a very isolated one incident out of thousands that might have provoked even some media attention, becomes very knee-jerk policymaking to kind of quell emotions in the public eye. So that might make someone feel better initially, but when they open up that bill folder and then they run it through committees and then that bill passes, it generally affects hundreds more people negatively than maybe that one isolated situation positively. You know, and then people running large organizations with 3,000 employees have to operationalize that new legislation and change the policies and the practices and the way to go about their daily business. And they scratch their head as to, why are we doing this? Nothing but bad is happening from this. So, you know, some law's great, some policy's great. We all need it, and we need to follow it. But policy that arises out of incidents and reactions over kind of pragmatism and prudence really are not generally the best for large organizations running a system, not situations of individual people.
Follow. Did you ever have success educating the media, or is that hopeless?
I actually did. I actually had, I was the absolute whipping boy in Arizona for a long time. I think I had the most negative articles of any director in the history of the United States. And, but
We're going to produce a ranking on that.
I did. At least at the time, I was the winner. And, but I did. But whether it's media or it's your legislature, both of them are almost equally misinformed when it comes to really the complexities of the problems. They're, again, hearing emotions and reacting to them. So I did a lot of work talking to the media, and some media were very much more reasonable, and some just wanted clicks for ad buys. So it just depends. But I think it's paramount for commissioners and secretaries and directors to have a good relationship with the media for those reasons, because for every one you can't reach, there's one you've informed a bit. And the same with the legislature. I spent most of my time just educating committees at legislature, and so they could walk out of the room and go, I never really thought about it that way. I mean, that was success.
And I think, by the way, this is, you know, the reason that I wanted to bring this panel together is that so much of the media coverage of this issue of kids sleeping in offices follows a narrative which, you know, doesn't cover so many of the things that we talked about today. Primarily, it's a narrative that says so many kids are sleeping in offices because we haven't invested enough in preventive services. Yeah. And it doesn't take account, again, of the fact that we have reduced the number of kids in foster care. So, you know, you can go upstream, and I think everybody on this panel is in favor of preventive services and going upstream, but the specific policies and the bad incentives that have led to this particular crisis almost never get covered in the media, and it is infuriated, I think, to a lot of policymakers and folks who are in these positions of authority, where they're like, I am continually trying to explain why it is that I have no place to put these kids, whether I'm trying to explain it to, you know, the local newspaper or to a federal judge, and no one is listening to what I'm saying. So anyway, go ahead.
Thank you. So these questions are sort of in track with what I was thinking. Like, you guys are from disparate states politically. You have Republicans, you have Democrats running in leadership posts. You guys seem generally all aligned with each other's policy prescriptions. What's the, when you have that, right, you have some kind of advocacy, like on other issues, whether you're a microchip manufacturer or you are an aviation company, and so down the street 5 blocks, you hire and they hit these issues. Like, what is that analog in this sector? I mean, you say, well, this is a group that doesn't have a clear stakeholder base. But of course, the philanthropic community spends an outsized amount of money on anything to do with children. They're the largest fundraising back that probably exists in the philanthropic world. So is there an organizational gravity around this, especially given that this isn't like some issues where you mentioned ideological have been a barrier, but the practitioners, from what I've observed, are in pretty clear agreement, at least on some big picture changes. So where does that exist? Does it need to exist? What would you advise?
It needs to exist. There are some advocacy organizations that try to represent the practitioner voice here in DC. One of the challenges is that the federal government doesn't run a system. You know, we have state and county administered systems all over the country, and so the federal government operates on the theoretical, regulatory, and fiscal level, and not administrative. And so sometimes there's a disconnect there. I think the field is overwhelmed in their jobs. You know, social workers are overwhelmed. Service providers are overwhelmed. Public agencies are overwhelmed right now. And they're not well organized to kind of share their perspectives. And if they do, it tends to be localized or state focused. And so I think that's some of what I'm seeing is why there's a bit of the field's voice is absent here in DC for a couple of those reasons, I would say.
I think I'd just add, I think there's a lot of, and y'all's experience are very different. I think there's a lot of groupthink in the child welfare field. People tend to jump on one issue. And I think right now, for example, there's a big move to get the child welfare system out of people's lives, so to speak. At other times, there's a big move to increase foster care because we're concerned about children being left in the community. And so, you know, I think sometimes we just have to kind of be independent voices and do the best we can, because I just don't know that there is any. I think we got a lot of reaction to media accounts, to groupthink, to sort of what's the latest trend, and I think the child welfare community tends to pick that up and run with it.
We have any other questions? Okay, great. Well, please join me in thanking our panel. Very excited to have them today.
Thank you.